Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to this Governance for Schools webinar. The focus of this morning's webinar is safe recruitment in 2020, and this webinar today is really as a follow-up to some questions we had as a consequence of the safeguarding webinar that we did back in the latter part of last year. So for those of you who took part in that webinar, welcome back, and for those of you who are joining us for the first time this morning, you're very, very welcome indeed. I am Steve Barker. I'm the one on the left-hand side of the screen there, and I'm joined by my colleague Linda Waghorn this morning.
Good morning.
And we are here on behalf of Better Governors, supporting this ongoing relationship that we've got with Governors for Schools, and we'll be facilitating this morning's webinar for you. Hopefully you all have sight of the question icon on the dashboard. If you'd like to ask a question at any time, please do type your question into the panel and hit the send button, and we will respond to it as quickly as we possibly can. We've got quite a number of people joining us this morning, which is lovely. That does mean that potentially we won't be able to answer every single question on an individual basis, but what we will try and do is actually group the questions together which are of a similar theme and respond to those in perhaps a slightly more general way. But please do keep the questions coming as we're going through. The aims of the webinar today are first and foremost to ensure that all of you who we're assuming are involved in governance in some way, shape or form, whatever your role in governance, that we actually achieve some form of clarity on the responsibilities of governors for safe recruitment in our schools in 2020. We also want to ensure that everybody's aware of how governors should go about monitoring this key aspect of their role, which of course is absolutely part of compliance. It's part of the framework of statutory duties specifically relating to safeguarding, but clearly a key aspect of compliance here. And also to reflect on how safe recruitment is in our individual schools, in our multi-academy trusts, etc. So that's where we're coming from as far as the session is actually concerned this morning. And at that point, I'm going to hand over to Linda.
So safe recruitment fits under a wider umbrella of safeguarding generally. And those that joined us in, I think it was September that we looked at safeguarding overall. This is a very important element of that general safeguarding umbrella. And you can see here from the a direct quote here from Keeping Children Safe in Education that it relies on a culture of safe recruitment. So that culture, building a culture that has high expectations of people who come to work or volunteer in our environment, that from the very beginning, from the very moment they have a connection with your organisation, they understand that the safe recruitment, safeguarding as a whole is part of the whole culture and the expectations and the continual understanding and development of practice and policy under this banner. And of course that last part of this quote, making sure that those practices around recruitment, whether they're in academies or free schools or maintained schools, the rules are exactly the same in all kinds of educational establishments, that we are trying at the very earliest opportunity showing people that we have very high safeguarding standards, so to deter people who think they can slip under the radar without going through the right checks, to reject those people who might present a cause for concern in terms of their practice and their background, and to identify those people who might be at risk of abusing children. So all of those practices that we have are all bound up in that overall culture that is put in place by the school.
I think, sorry, Linda, I think it's actually fair to say that as governors, there's a really good question to ask is, have we ever turned people away because we weren't assured? So again, if there is any doubt at all, I think my position on this would be, if in doubt, don't offer a position, don't let somebody volunteer, don't let somebody become a paid member of staff, because this is, we can never be 100% sure. So these are the procedures, and I think keyword for me here is that help, deter, reject, or identify. So if in any doubt at all, then I think we have to think long and hard about whether we should go ahead with any of these appointments.
And whilst all of the checks and things that we put in place that we're going to talk more about, there is a need to test people's understanding of what safeguarding is in your culture, and to make sure that is part of the process of recruitment, so that you can test that understanding, and as Steve says, to reject any of those people that you feel would be a risk to your organisation. So if we look as we normally would do in these sessions with you, we give you first of all the regulations that sit around this. So if we move on to the next slide, we'll see that the main document that we use as governors and trustees to inform our knowledge base is the Keeping Children Safe in Education document. And there is a whole chapter or section on safer recruitment in this document, and this sets out the expectations both of the school leaders and of the governing body in response to what they need to do in their organisation. And it is important that anybody who is having oversight, whether you're part of a committee in your school or academy, or you are an individual lead governor on safeguarding, that your first point is to understand those responsibilities as laid out in Keeping Children Safe in Education.
Just a note at this point, folks, there are one or two questions coming through. We're not going to answer them just at this moment because they all relate to issues that we are going to cover later in the webinar. So please keep those questions coming. Just because we're ignoring them at this point in time doesn't mean to say we can't see them, but they are absolutely things that are coming up in this morning's webinar. So bear with us and your questions will be responded to. So let's, we've got the regulations in place, Keeping Children Safe in Education. There are some associated documentation that go with that inform practice at school level. It is the document for safeguarding as that umbrella subject. We're focusing on safer recruitment this morning. So let's now look at what it is that the role of governors needs to look like in terms of compliance with that guidance. So the main role of a board is to ensure by seeking assurance. So we're not operational. You don't need to have an operational working knowledge to do governance well. And in fact, sometimes that can get in the way. You need to take a strategic overview, but you need to seek assurance that the school or academy as an organisation understands, firstly, regulated activity. We're going to talk a little bit about that in a moment, and that the school undertakes those checks on those individuals that are coming to work or volunteer within that organisation, and that on a recruitment panel, and most of the time the recruitment is being placed in the hands of school leaders rather than governors. The exception to that is in maintained schools when they appoint a head teacher. Maybe not the same in academies, because there's lots of different permutations possible, but that somebody on the recruitment panel has at least undertaken that safer recruitment certified training. So they have undergone an in-depth program, a lot of it online, we'll say more about that later, but they have demonstrated a deeper understanding of what is required from both that reference document, Keeping Children Safe in Education, and through undertaking a program that tests that knowledge and understanding. Okay, and just to make the point here that Linda mentioned regulated activity. This is one part of the statutory framework. This is some guidance issued by the government in general. It's not specific to education, but we're talking about its specific application in educational settings. Regulated activity, really the phrase regulated activity is the question about, does this person require a disclosure and barring service check in order to undertake their role in school? And when we talk about school staff in the context of safer recruitment, as Linda's already said, it's paid and unpaid staff. So whether you're volunteering or you're in a paid role, the same questions need to be asked. And the very first one of all of these is, what we're doing with this person is what we want this person to actually engage in, coming under that banner of regulated activity. You've got the reference for this document in the slide pack this morning. This is quite operational. I'm not suggesting that governors need to download and read this, although you would need some assurance as governors. I would suggest we would need assurance as governors that certainly the designated safeguarding lead and the head teacher do understand what this particular part of the legislation says. And as I said, the reality for schools is that there are two strands of regulated activity. One is you are engaged in regulated activity if you undertake certain work, and an obvious part of that work is being a teacher or anybody else who is employed to work directly in an unsupervised manner with children. So anybody who is employed to work directly with children in the school or anywhere else is engaged in regulated activity and therefore needs a disclosure and barring service check. The second part of it, which is I think for me probably the most important part, is regulated activity is also defined by where that activity takes place. And as I'm sure it comes as no surprise to you, if anybody is engaged in activity in a school, because it is a school, then it also qualifies as regulated activity. So for me, this is just a quick reminder and a bit of a placeholder, this slide. Don't lose sight and ensure that everybody in your school is aware of the rules and regulations surrounding that.
So if we look at probably what you would expect in many organisations, but let's just be really clear here, we're talking about schools and academies at this point and your oversight of these areas, then there is a need to check that somebody is who they say they are. There's some operational guidance about this.
Sorry, Linda, to interrupt. There was a question just come through from Rachel. Rachel saying, do you feel that in order to take a strategic view, you don't need any knowledge of the operational side of an institution? The reason I've interrupted there, because clearly what we're looking at here is quite operational. This is actually a checklist of, sorry, that's not very good English. This is a list of all of those things that we need to check or that our schools need to check. So yes, governors do need to know where things like this, these operational lists of what the regulations actually specify, where they're held, so that from time to time, part of our overview is about checking compliance. If we don't know what it means to be compliant, that makes that a very challenging role, I would suggest. So there are times, Rachel, when yes, a little bit of operational knowledge is important. So that's what we've done this morning, is threaded the level of operational knowledge that we need in order to fulfill our strategic role.
I think this is important because if you don't know what it is that you are holding the school to account for, if you don't know what they should have done, then you won't know the questions you need to ask to test compliance, or the things you might need to see if you're making a visit to school to test compliance. So you've got here a list, excuse me, a list of the different types of checks that individuals working in schools and academies need to go through. They need to, as I say, know that they are who they say they are. You need to check that they haven't been barred from working with children. And of course, you need to check whether somebody is physically and mentally fit for work. And there will be a variety of different providers or checks that you go through depending on your school or academy. Of course, in many times now, we're looking at people coming from overseas to work in schools, or who have been, their origin is from overseas, and checking both that they've got the right to work in this country, that their qualifications and the things that need to ensure that we are able to employ those people in the UK system need to be carried out if that is in fact the case. So all of those checks will be done operationally. Usually your school business manager would have a responsibility for that operational HR side, but in larger MATs you may have a little team that is centrally based that will carry out that function. But you just need to understand how that works in your organisation so that you know who it is that you link with if that's your responsibility to do some of those deeper checks on behalf of your board.
Now, we've got quite a few questions that are being generated as a result of this slide, so let's just focus on one or two of those at the moment. Karen saying, should they check teachers barred list? It isn't included on your list. Well, it is, Karen, it's part of the second one there where it talks about an enhanced DBS, that's the disclosure and barring service check. But the first two are linked. You verify somebody's identity in order to apply for the disclosure and barring service check, and dependent on the position, that will include a barred list check. So that part in brackets there, that is specifically aimed at those individuals, including teachers, who are on a list one of several lists that may bar them from working directly with children. So that is part of that check. And we've then got another question coming here from Elias. This applies to all schools, so from nursery right the way through to post-16, whether you're a special school or a mainstream school. And as Linda's already said, it applies equally to academies and all other independent schools, as well as maintained schools as well. Most of these regulations, in terms of the checks, come from the school staffing regulations of 2009, but the requirement to undertake them is extended through independent school regulations, and also reiterated in keeping children safe. And keeping children safe in itself is statutory guidance, of course.
And there's a couple of questions about the deeper level of checks on overseas or on health. There will be operational processes in place in your school, and those people who are doing those operational processes, part of our strategic overview is to check that those people understand what is in place to carry out those checks and understand the detail that sits around that. Governors just need to ensure they are well trained and capable of doing those things, and then that those checks have actually been done. So I'm not going to go into any detail on those individual questions, because those are probably are too operational.
Indeed. We've got a couple of questions here. First one, how often are checks undertaken? All of these checks, as you can see, the title of the slide is pre-appointment. The requirement is to check before you engage somebody, before you appoint somebody to work in the school. And so therefore, as governors, that is what we should actually be looking to ensure. Before somebody is given particularly unsupervised access to children, have we undertaken all of those checks and have we kept appropriate records? There are lots of questions coming here through about mental and physical health, that third bullet point. As Linda says, our intention today isn't to go through all of these checks individually, but this specific one, there's already about a dozen or so questions come through on this, just to say this is a check that basically is asking somebody to self-certify that they are mentally and physically fit to undertake the work. So for example, if you are employing or intended to employ a new caretaker in your school, you would ask that person if they are physically fit to lift, to engage in moving cleaning equipment, that kind of thing, because that has a direct bearing on their ability to do the job.
I think there's another aspect to that as well, is that we do have equality legislation, and that if somebody applies for a job that they could do with reasonable adaptations, we need to be aware of what those reasonable adaptations are required of us in order to make sure that they are able to do their job effectively, and that we have provided that equality by meeting that. So it is a two-way process. It isn't about trying to discriminate against people who may have suffered a period of mental illness or a physical illness, but it is about adapting ourselves and working. So checking, yes, they can do that job with reasonable adaptations is clearly something that we would wish to do.
And again, I mean, one doesn't want to turn this into a witch hunt, as Linda's saying, but of course the reason we do this, and as I say, most authorities, most trusts, most employers involved in the education sector will do this as a self-declaration. And the reason you do that is because if somebody fails to disclose, and we've got one or two comments coming here about individuals wishing to not disclose, that's fine. But if somebody doesn't disclose something which later turns out to be material to their ability to do the job, then clearly that's something that one would want to follow up on. Question here about overseas checks. The overseas checks really are to reflect the fact that sometimes, and okay, things may change a little bit after 11 p.m. tomorrow with Brexit, etc. But there are a number of people, a very large number of people working in this country, not just overseas residents, but people who perhaps are resident in this country who've been on gap years, perhaps before they come and ask for a job in a school. If they have been overseas, there is a responsibility on the employer to establish that that person has not got any criminal records that would then perhaps put them on a barred list or the equivalent of a barred list in another country. So there is full guidance available to schools, and again, this is getting into quite a lot of operational details, but schools will know this. The role of governors is to seek assurance, as Linda mentioned earlier, that schools are aware of those overseas checks, and there is evidence that where appropriate, they have actually undertaken them. So if you've got somebody who you know has just done a gap year in Southeast Asia, Australasia, etc., you would expect the school to actually explore that in interview. What did you do? Where did you go there? And then if somebody had been, for example, as part of that, employed at the school in, let's say, Vietnam for 6 months, you would expect just to check with the appropriate agency, and there's full details on the Home Office website on how schools can do that. And schools should know that, they should have access. And again, it's that level we should be questioning as governors. Do we know about how to do overseas checks? Have we got evidence that we're actually conducting them?
Okay, there's still some questions that are coming up later in this in our presentation. So again, we'll answer some of those as we go along.
Okay, so let's move on to the next slide. And again, we've had some questions on references already. So this is the bit where we talk about references. And again, we're still in that mode of saying, what are those things that we do pre-appointment? Now, there's always been a little bit of a debate about references. And when Keeping Children Safe first came out, it actually made it quite explicit that the expectation was that all schools took up references before interview. Now, very often that's not practical, and lots of head teachers say, well, I end up writing 20 references for one person, etc., etc. It's not a good use of time. I think custom and practice has said now that it's not necessary always to have those references. It might be helpful, but it's not necessary to always have them. But if references are not available at interview, if a job offer is made, that job offer then is made conditional upon receipt and checking of satisfactory references. And for that reason, these are the rules and the expectations about those references. Firstly, references should always be in writing, and that does include, some schools now are accepting email references. If schools get an email reference, good practice is certainly to check the email address. Does it look like a .school, name of local authority, or whatever? Have they checked that this does look like a bona fide email address from an educational institution? And if there's any doubt, then it would be sensible to follow that up with a telephone call, just to actually establish that, yes, this is the person who is capable of making and entitled to make that request. Sorry, make that reference rather, in response to the request. All references, when they're received, should be scrutinised, and we're scrutinising those references basically to check back and say, okay, does this still read like the person that described themselves, that responded to the answers that were asked of them in the interview? Because one of the things that we should always do is to be checking for consistency or lack of contradiction, as we've said here, and also completeness. Are there gaps in somebody's career path in an application form which we've asked questions about? Does that get borne out by a specific reference? Always, in the case of schools, the reference should include one from the most recent or current employer. And that is something that I'm personally involved in doing safeguarding audits in some schools. That's something that isn't always the case that we find at the moment. Even if somebody is leaving their school, perhaps under a little bit of a cloud, it doesn't matter. You still need a reference from that last employer. That's really important. References should always be objective and factual and used to support an appointment. Lots of schools now are producing a reference template, and it becomes more of a tick box. I think as governors, we should have a view about the appropriateness of those. It's very easy now for lots of employers to turn around and say, well, my only reference is I'm confirming this person worked here between this date and that date. That certainly in the commercial world is not at all unusual. So if we've got people perhaps coming into the education system for the first time, perhaps in a school business management role or an office admin role, etc., that may not be unusual. But certainly if you've got somebody who has worked in a school as a teacher, as a teaching assistant, etc., in the past, you would expect slightly more than that. And if you don't get it in response to a request for a written reference, good practice would always be for head teachers or whoever is leading that particular recruitment to follow that up with a telephone call.
And I think it also, because so many references are now written in that very factual way without giving much information, sometimes clouded with the Data Protection Act as an excuse for that. But this places then a great deal of importance on framing a set of interview questions tailored for the particular individual based on their application to test out some of their suitability for the role in a little bit more detail. There's also been a question about references for governors, which I think is an interesting one. Any appointments that the board makes itself, there should be some kind of procedure that meets the same cultural expectations for safer recruitment as the organisation itself. So if you are appointing to the board, what is your procedure? How does that mirror the values, the ethos and the safeguarding culture of your school? And if this person is unknown to the school prior to that, untested, then I believe that you should have a process that takes up some suitability references. You should have a process that tests their suitability to be on the board. So I would say that that is good practice, but it's up to you how that is put in place. It's your procedure as a board.
And I think that comes back to this idea. This is all about compliance. Compliance and the responsibility for it rests with the governing body or the governing board, and therefore it is for us as governors to be assured. And again, coming back to that phrase that Linda and I keep using, our role is to ensure by seeking assurance. We need assurance as governors that our schools have appropriate procedures. And again, it's about that deterring, identifying, and hopefully preventing undesirable people. So yeah, even if it's a parent volunteer, we need to think about, well, is it acceptable that if this is somebody that's been known to the school for several years as chair of the PTA, now wants to come in and do some voluntary work, or would you want them to submit a couple of references on something they've done beforehand? That's for schools to decide, but we do need to think about, does that mean that our recruitment processes are rigorous? Which they need to be. And just one final point on the bottom of the slide before we move on, good practice to sign and date references when they're checked. And that's really a reference back, sorry, pun unintended there, but if we are seeking references after a job offer has been made, the person or people who have been interviewing should check those references, because otherwise that scrutiny isn't really happening. And therefore, just to be able to demonstrate and to evidence that you have actually looked at the reference after the event, it is good practice to actually put a date on it when you've looked at it, and just initials, etc., so someone can identify who did that. Then coming back to the issue of safer recruitment training, and we've had a couple of questions on this, so if you've asked a question on this, apologise again that we haven't actually come to that yet, but hopefully those questions are all reflected in this particular slide. It is mandatory under Regulation 9 in school staffing regulations that anybody involved in an interview must have satisfactorily completed safer recruitment training. Now, a couple of people have asked, does this training today provide the answer to that question? Is this the mandatory training? I think it's something now that has become a little less clear than in the past. Historically, there was only one provider of that training, and it had to be updated every 3 years. It was fully certificated, etc. That's not the case any longer, but I think what we do need to be assuring now is that this training today is very much a briefing on what safer recruitment looks like from the governance perspective, and specifically, as you can already see, we're focusing on compliance. The expectation, and if you do look at some of the other providers of safer recruitment training, theirs are very much about making those who sit on panels aware of the bigger issues in safeguarding generally, rather than specifically safeguarding as one element of that. So it's making people aware of what we should be seeing if we're not asking those questions ourselves. What sort of questions about safeguarding should we be asking potential candidates? So for example, I was on an appointment panel a couple of weeks ago, And one of the questions that was asked was all about children's behaviour, and basically it was actually asking a potential teaching assistant at school how they would respond if a child did X to them. That's a very good way of actually getting to understand their values about children, the way in which they respond, and actually their understanding about how schools operate. So, that's a good safeguarding question. You might ask them something very specific about, if they've already worked in the school, what they did when a certain situation actually presented itself to them. But it is about ensuring that safeguarding is put on the agenda. Again, we should see it actually referred to in job descriptions and hopefully in adverts as well. But safeguarding absolutely is a fundamental part of school responsibility, and we would want to see it reflected in every single interview that we're actually conducting in our schools. Somebody's asked a question here, sorry Linda, how often it should be refreshed. That's for governors to determine now, but I would suggest that safeguarding generally is changing so dramatically. We would anticipate that governors should be updating on a very regular basis, but at least annually. The training that we're doing for governors in 2020 is very different from what it was this time in 2019, just because there is so much happening now. Child sexual exploitation is a very significant issue now. County lines is growing more and more and is becoming an issue in local areas where it hasn't actually been seen in the past. So all of those things are really important, and therefore governors too should be refreshing their training.
The one thing I would say about the in-depth training that is offered in a variety of different guises, often online, but sometimes face-to-face, is that there is some kind of testing of the knowledge that has been gained and testing the understanding of that knowledge. So that would be a deeper dive into the safer recruitment than we are doing in this session, where we're introducing you to the topic and the compliance aspects of that. So I think it would be wise to think of this in terms of training for governors as well, to think about what governors need to know in depth. But where you are not the member of a recruitment panel to decide the member of staff who is appointed, that's usually with the head teacher, you are often as a governor invited to be on a panel as a governor representative, and you need to recognise, and I've certainly been invited as a governor to sit on a panel for a school business manager, so an external appointment, where when I was given a set of questions that were going to be asked, recognised very quickly that there were no safeguarding questions included whatsoever. And I was able as a governor to say, well, surely we should be asking this external candidate some safeguarding, some safer recruitment questions, which were then included as a result. So understanding what those tests need to be, and again ensuring that if you're invited to participate, you make sure that the school is compliant with its responsibilities, are really beneficial to your board.
And Catherine's asked a question which is on a similar vein to that. I think annual retraining, is that for governors or also for staff? I would suggest that governors do need to actually update their training on a very regular basis. Certainly staff, I would expect it to be at least annually, but again, lots of schools now will have a safeguarding item as a recurring agenda focus on most staff meetings. Now, I would expect that in a governing body meeting as well. What are we doing? What is the context from a safeguarding perspective in our school? But certainly annual retraining is a very good practice element, as far as I'm concerned, for everybody involved in the school community, governors as well. And just going back to the slide in front of us in terms of that training, the idea is that we are not just making governors aware of what needs to be part of that interview, that recruitment process, but also making them aware, as I say, of that broader safeguarding context. There are lots of people in the marketplace. Most of these have to be paid for, I'm afraid, but probably one of the most popular one is the NSPCC, the National Society of Prevention of Cruelty to Children. There's a 4-hour online module, and there is a cost of that, a cost attached to that of £35 at the moment. And you can find that by going onto their website, but there are many, many other providers out there.
What we've done this far in the presentation to you this morning is to outline expectations as laid out by Keeping Children Safe in Education. This isn't the end of the story, of course, because ensuring that that your organisation remains compliant with its responsibilities will also make sure that as governors, you need to check that people have their training, their understanding of safeguarding generally, in order to maintain the security of that culture, updated as things change. So annually is an expectation for all staff to have some update for safeguarding generally, but also making sure that there are these kind of tests and training and expectations. You may change procedures because of particular safeguarding risks in your school. How is that communicated to all staff, whatever their position in schools, caretakers, catering staff, volunteers, and making sure that as a result the culture remains vigilant to any risks that may develop or be developing.
Okay, there's a couple of very quick questions here, specifically on safer recruitment training. Safer recruitment training, every panel, regardless of whether it's got governor involvement or not, but every panel that takes place is convened in a school to appoint somebody must have at least one person on it that has completed the safeguarding, safer recruitment training. Therefore, yes, it is, it's mandatory that if there's a governor on the panel for a head teacher or a deputy head teacher appointment to maintain school, one of those governors must have done the training. Good practice, of course, would be for all governors involved in interviewing to have done the training, so that there is a general awareness and not just resting on one individual. Okay, let's move on there, and we'll launch our first poll of the session today. And this poll is coming up on your screens now, hopefully. Yes, there we go. Really is relating to that safer recruitment training, and just getting you to think about, if you know the question, but know the answer to the question, how many of those on your governing board have actually undertaken safer recruitment certificated training in your particular establishment. So see, people are beginning to respond to that now. If you can cast your vote, we'd be very grateful. Just over half have done that now, so just a few more moments and then we'll close the poll. Just while waiting for those final people just to cast their votes. Question here from Karen: does this webinar comply with safer recruitment? As we made the point earlier, Karen, today's webinar is actually more of a briefing to make those involved in governance aware of what their responsibilities on safer recruitment are. Safer recruitment training is one of those responsibilities. So no, we would not suggest that this prepares you fully. We think it prepares you very well for your role in safer recruitment in schools if you have one, but this is about the strategic overview of the process of safer recruitment in schools. So this is about awareness raising. This isn't about fully equipping you. We would suggest that you do undertake one of those specific modules to do that.
And we're not testing your knowledge and understanding, where most of these online programs have an element of testing what you've understood as you go along.
Okay, so we're going to close that poll now because everybody that's going to vote has done so, and share the results of that with you. And they should be up on your slide now with the bar chart. Almost 60% have said that 2 or more have done it. That's fantastic. We would, both of us, Linda and I, would say that's good practice. Superb. 7% have said none. That's not quite such good practice. I would suggest that maybe something needs to actually be done about that fairly quickly. And 36% of you that don't know, therefore, good question to go back to school and ask. Certainly it's worth it. It's not being discussed, depending on how long you've been governors, of course. If it's not being discussed for some time, raise it, ask the clerk to put it on an agenda, just to get an understanding in the governing body. Have we got anybody who's done the training? If not, there's a training need been identified there, because you never know when you might be needed as a governor to support a recruitment. Therefore, good idea to get a couple of people or more actually trained up.
And another point I would make under this item, under this particular area, is that there is a standing item on your agenda in most schools for safeguarding. And often what happens is that agenda item comes up supported by maybe no direct documentation, although most head teachers' reports will have something related to safeguarding. And in too many cases, there isn't any discussion or questions around safeguarding. So if you don't know and safer recruitment is part of the questioning of a governing body under the new Ofsted framework. This gives you a very good question to ask to generate discussion under that safeguarding heading if you've not got any direct documentation or visit reports to consider. So it's always worth testing your understanding, and it may be, as Steve said, that you may be a new governor who doesn't know the answer to this question, so it may be about building a knowledge bank, or it may be that it simply hasn't been visited for some time and would be good for all the board to understand what needs to happen next. You might need to test how long ago those people undertook certification and consider whether that needs to be updated.
One quick question here from Tamsin. Tamsin is asking, online versus face-to-face training, which is best? I don't think we can really, without giving you a rather biased view on this, Linda and I engage in both. I think it's about what's suitable for what meets your needs best. Clearly, there's an awful lot of you here this morning, so clearly you voted with your feet to actually engage in online training today. That's fantastic, and thank you very much for doing that. But similarly, most nights of the week, Linda and I are engaged in face-to-face training. Some people prefer that. It's the content rather than the delivery method that I think is the important thing from our perspective.
Yes, and no training is worse than either of those kinds. So whatever works in order to be compliant for your board, then undertake that in whichever way. And it may be a mixture for your board. They may have different personal preferences. Just make sure that it's available in a format that suits both.
Indeed. Okay, let's move on. Just a little bit about the single central record. Some of you who've perhaps listened into some of the Better Governor webinars that we've done recently will be very aware that we've been talking about one of the myth-busting videos on YouTube that Ofsted have produced recently, where Ofsted said they don't expect governors to check the single central record. And I think clarity is really important on that. Ofsted is saying they don't have an expectation because they don't. If they had an expectation, they would be making the rules, which they're not allowed to do. I would respectfully suggest, Linda and I would actually both say to you that it is a governor's responsibility, governing body, governing board responsibility to ensure that compliance is present in all areas, and a single central record is a really important part of that. It is mandatory, therefore it's our role as governors to ensure it's in place. If we don't check it ourselves, and this comes back to that, isn't this a bit operational question that we had earlier? Yeah, some things are, but some things are rightly operational because that gives us the ability to see the bigger picture from a strategic perspective. So I would suggest, if you're not conducting that check yourself, you have to think as a governing body, as a governing board rather, how do we do it? Because again, forgive me, it's something I often say, but with the greatest respect to head teachers, if your answer to the question, how do I know, and in this case, how do I know a single central record is correct, because the head teacher tells me, that ain't a very good response. It really isn't. If the head teacher shares with us evidence about how the checks are done and how they, perhaps in their role as a senior leader, ensures that the checks are done, that's something completely different. But it is perfectly acceptable for a governor to do those checks. It's not mandatory for a governor to do those checks on the single central record, but it is possible. So the record itself is mandatory, and as the name implies, it is a single central record, therefore the single bit means it has to exist complete in a place where it is accessible. And there are very specific fields required. And again, we don't need to go into all of those fields, but you won't be surprised to know that it does actually reflect the list of pre-employment checks that we went through a few slides back. And lots of schools recently, we've had governors saying to us, well, I'm not allowed to look at the single central record because it contains lots of personal data. If it contains lots of personal data, I think as governors we should be asking, why does it contain lots of personal data? The only personal data it has to contain is the name of the member of staff. Now, the single central record is simply a record of the pre-appointment checks that we have done on anybody, paid or unpaid, who is working in the school. So it does include the single central record, identity checks, and all of those other things that we've talked about. It doesn't need to record numbers, it doesn't need to have passport numbers or anything like that on it. Purely the record is intended to say the check was conducted by this person on this date. So all the single central record has to have is a list of names down one side, a list of the mandatory checks, which are freely available for people to have a look at on certainly within safer recruitment, within keeping children safe in education rather, and also in Ofsted documentation, which I'm going to talk about in just a moment. But it's the date on which that check was done and the initials of the person that conducted that check. Now that might be the school business manager, that might be a member of the office staff, but very often, if not always, historically it's been checked always by Ofsted. Very often they're still doing it now. It is our role as governors to ensure it's compliant. How we do that is entirely up to us to determine at local level, but that assurance of compliance is our responsibility. Couple of questions here about what information it should contain. Does the single central record also contain contact details? No, absolutely not. The school will have contact details somewhere else. If they choose to put them into a single central record, that's fine, they can do that, but it doesn't have to. As I say, even if you have got a school that puts people's dates of birth, their home address, mobile telephone number, passport number, I think as governors we should be questioning, is that sensible from a data protection perspective? But also, by the very fact we're doing that, we're putting lots of personal data in that does limit the use and the access to that document, and therefore, is it a sensible way to construct it?
And it isn't entirely necessary. If you need another identifier because you've got a number of Pat Jones on in your school profile, then you would use another identifier in just that list of names. But one of the advantages for me as a chair of governors who has a role in safeguarding in my school is that when I do my annual check of the single central record, which is an Excel spreadsheet held by the school business manager in my case, that's not an unusual way for it to be done in schools. But one of the things that I noted when I did my check in the autumn last year was that it wasn't Data Protection Act compliant. There were people on the record as volunteers and as governors who should have been removed from that as part of the Data Protection Act requirements. So it had a multi-compliance aspect in terms of that governor oversight. So what I've been advising clerks in my clerks training is if it is not checked annually by a governor with safeguarding responsibilities and knowledge, because you need to know what you're looking for in order to say that it's compliant. I would know what a circuit board looked like, but I wouldn't know whether it was right or wrong. And so if I don't have some kind of knowledge beforehand, it's a meaningless exercise. But if I'm not doing it that way as a board, what way are we going to do that? If we're going to make a change from this practice, what are we going to replace it with? And how robust is that change? So if it meets your needs and is appropriate for your board, and you don't feel you need to change it, that's fine. But if you want to replace it with something else, design how that is going to meet the needs of your board, ensuring by seeking assurance. Don't just say, oh, we won't do that anymore and replace it with no check whatsoever.
And don't forget, the single central record is just one component of safer recruitment. A couple of questions here about should reference addresses and reference details, but that's actually not part of the single central record. What we should be asking as governors is, what assurances have we got? Again, coming back to the point that Linda's just made, what assurance have we got? But recruitment is safe across the piece in our school, and therefore, from time to time, I am the safeguarding governor. I'm sure that's no surprise to many of you. I'm the safeguarding governor in a couple of schools where I'm involved. And if I'm going in to do the check of the single central record, I will say, well, can I look at 3 random? And I'll say, one from the top drawer, one from the middle drawer, or 3 devices, it's a smaller drawer, etc. 3 files just to look at what have we got in that person's HR file that suggests to me and provides evidence to me that we have done everything that we need to do to ensure that this person's as safe as they can be to be, allowed to work with our children. So, a lot of those things that Linda said about compliance, data protection, you might spot in there, and that's perfectly okay to actually draw those to the school's attention. But actually, most good practice HR files that you'll look at or compliant with good practice, there'll be an induction checklist, for example, at the beginning of it, which will, for them to tick off that this person's had their induction, and that included health and safety and safeguarding training. We've got their references, we've got their DBS check, we've got the right to work, all of those things that need to be checked. Somebody, school business manager ultimately has responsibility for that, ought to keep those up to date. And I think if we're looking at HR files and it's all a bit jumbled and there's no real order to it, that probably tells us something about what's going on in our schools. And perhaps we ought to ask a few more questions, because ultimately the buck stops with the governing body. It is our job to ensure that recruitment is safe.
And the other element there is, isn't it better that somebody from your board develops some knowledge of what they need to look for from a wider safer recruitment angle, conducts appropriate safeguarding visits to the school, and identifies any area of improvement before Ofsted come and identify that as a failure? So this is about compliance and governance being part of an effective management of the school. And when my business manager in the 2 schools that I'm governor at the moment know that I'm coming, they do that mental, is it all up to date and ready for Linda to look at? That is a good thing, because it focuses the mind. Everybody in school is busy and focusing on those things because a governor is coming to check it is a really helpful activity that governors undertake.
And an interesting observation here from Julia. Julie's saying it's a massive responsibility to check SCR compliance. What if you miss something? Should a professional audit be done? I'm not sure about that. I mean, certainly when I do it, there's a couple of it is a big responsibility, but that doesn't mean it's also an onerous task, I would suggest. I would ask a few simple questions. I mean, we'll talk about the Ofsted document in just a moment, but that's a really good place to go for a checklist. But one of the key things I would want to know is how many people have we got on the staff in the school at the moment? And the very quick check is to look how many names there are on your single central record under the staffing tab. Most people will do this these days, I would suggest, with an Excel spreadsheet or something similar. If it's a paper record, that's fine. But literally, have we got everybody who works in the school on there is a really good check. Who else do we allow access to our children? So have we got sports coaches coming in? Have we got peripatetic music teachers? Have we got other outside agencies, so behaviour support services, people like that? Who else is coming in and working with our children? Have we got them on the single central group? Are governors there? What about parental volunteers? So I would expect a good one to have perhaps a different tab for each of those groups, and just to check we've got everybody there who should be, not line by line, but just an absolute number. And then I would actually use the Ofsted checklist just to check, have we got all of those headings, so all of the various lists, so there aren't that many responsibilities, there's only about 8 or 9 of them altogether. Have we got them all listed, and have we got something filled in for everybody? So I did a check a couple of weeks ago, and school business manager happened to say to me, well, this person, we're still waiting for their overseas check to actually come back, and there was a big red highlighting mark on that particular box. That's absolutely fine. So hopefully, I would say it's not an onerous responsibility. It absolutely is a serious one. There's no doubt about that. A couple of people asking questions about how long we should keep evidence. Realistically, all documentation should only be kept for the period for when its use was actually specified. So this is just for a check. If you've taken a copy of somebody's passport, you've done it to make your check. As soon as you made the check, you don't need it anymore, so you should securely destroy that. You may need to keep certain documents to prove right to work in the UK. That's an ongoing requirement, but anything for anything else, as long as you record that person's DBS number, the DBS check or the certificate isn't necessarily yours to keep anyway. So all of those things, important that the school reads the guidance, and that HR files kept in schools are adherent to not just the guidance for single central record, but also the data protection guidance. Okay, let's move on at that point. Just a couple of reminders that this is still on the Ofsted agenda. A couple of people did put comments on about the single central record. It's always checked by Ofsted. Respectfully, I would suggest that's not necessarily true anymore. It was always checked by Ofsted under the previous framework that finished in July last year, but since September 2019 we have a new framework, and certainly my knowledge of schools in the local area where I am, it is not always checked now. Safeguarding will always be a focus, there is no doubt about that, and governors may be asked questions on safeguarding, they probably will be asked questions. They may, as part of that, be asked questions on safer recruitment, which is what this current slide is.
And certainly the experience I've had recently of briefing clerks in those schools where there have been Ofsted inspections under the new framework, there appears to be a testing of the culture of safeguarding on their initial entrance through the door, and then further diving in. The deep dive is a theme through the whole of the current Ofsted inspection, diving deeper where they feel they need more evidence to test their understanding of that safeguarding culture. So of course we do have, and in one case last night a clerk was telling me that at a recent inspection they were very much asked questions around the checking of the single central record, which was a very interesting one in the light of the Ofsted YouTube clip around that very topic. So these are a sample of questions that Ofsted have asked under the new training. You may or may not experience any or all of them, or indeed another safeguarding question, but it gives you a flavour of the kind of things that form the basis of their testing the evidence of your understanding and your oversight of safer recruitment as a whole.
And all of them do. I think all three of these questions are very good examples of things that do feed into that culture, aren't they? Now, we've got a couple of questions coming in here. Should we be checking single centre record termly or annually? That's for you to decide as governors. There's no right and wrong with that. I think regularly is the important thing. So certainly in schools that I'm involved in, I do it on probably an annual basis rather than more regularly than that, but it's entirely up to you.
Some of what might inform that is that if you have an intake of staff in significant numbers at other times of the year, so you might be a large secondary academy, you might be a trust member, and you might have a number of schools, you might want to check that more regularly because you have an intake of staff and you want to have that overview. But the largest number of staff would normally in most schools and organisations happen in September, so a good time of the year to do that annual update would be in November, when you've had 2 months since those people joined the school, in which to ensure that all of those checks have been carried out and are entered on the single central record.
There's a lot of questions still coming through about that single central record, so clearly this is something that's perplexing one or two people. Very, very quickly, yeah. Is this a trust level responsibility or local governing body, or both? I would suggest it's probably both. Ultimately, of course, the trust is the governing body ultimately, even though they might delegate some responsibilities locally. So the trust has to ensure a single central record exists in every school. And again, it's a single central record for the school, for the institution, not for the trust itself, I would suggest. But obviously that does imply there's some local responsibility there. Moira's asking a question. Morning, Moira. Do you need to check people who come in to teach music, etc., individually? Yes, absolutely. Anybody who is given unsupervised access to children absolutely must be fully checked. That can, of course, mean that your school, if you're buying a peripatetic music service from a local authority or anybody else, the employer can do those checks, but it is good practice, and I would suggest it's an expectation that we should have something in writing, a letter that says we have done these checks on your behalf. At the very least, the school should actually do an identity check and just confirm that person has had a DBS check. But no, it is perfectly acceptable for their employer to actually do those checks, and also to make sure that the employer provides safeguarding training for those people as well, of course.
A couple of questions under that bullet point 2 on the current slide about the types of questions that you'd expect to ask at interview. So again, that feels quite operational, but it's about the procedures that your school has in place for. Many schools will have a safer recruitment policy separately or as part of the safeguarding policy. But again, trusts and local authorities, you buy your HR services. HR services are very good at providing help with a whole range of things. They may provide an electronic question bank of questions that your school can select to use as interview. And again, being aware of what those processes are, asking that question to test how schools create a set of interview questions that include safer recruitment questions. A good question for a governing body to ask under that safeguarding agenda, testing safer recruitment practices in schools. So be aware of how those questions are put together and ensure that they always have some questions that are related to that safer recruitment. And again, that in-depth training on safer recruitment will equip those governors who have undergone that training with some deeper level types of questions that they might be exploring.
Okay, we've got one other comment here. Karen saying Ofsted told our school that we should not keep separate tabs of different categories. We were instructed it's a single central record. That's an interesting one, Karen. I would respectfully suggest that's not for Ofsted to tell you how to construct your single central record, and it's fairly petty to say that different workbooks on one Excel spreadsheet are not a single central record, because I would say in probably 99% of the schools that I'm involved in, and that's quite a large number, that is exactly what they do. And certainly our HR departments and other local authority HR departments would be advising schools to do exactly that. It makes it a more manageable list. I'm chair of trust board of a very large secondary school. We employ over 300 staff. It's a lot easier to find a teacher out of 129 that is out of 300, and so on and so forth. So I'm sorry, if an Ofsted inspector said that to me, I'm probably a fairly stroppy person, I would hand them a copy of the Keeping Children Safe in Education, which is a statutory guidance, and say, well, please tell me where it tells me in that document that I can't do that, because it doesn't.
And the YouTube video clip, Safeguarding in the Role of Governors, makes it explicit in that it is not for Ofsted to give governors a list of what they should and shouldn't do.
Exactly. Okay, let us move forward at that stage, because we've got one more poll we'd like to share with you, and time is actually pressing on this morning. Sorry, I hit too many buttons there. So the second poll that we're actually going to launch this morning is all about the overall there we go, it should be up on your screens now. The overall sort of oversight of safeguarding within our schools and how safer recruitment fits within that. So can you please have a look at those questions, just read them first of all, and then cast your vote in response. So you can tick as many as you like here. This is actually about what you include as part of your oversight. Quite a few people voting there already, so that's lovely, thank you.
There's a couple of questions both at the beginning of the session and as we went through around governors and references and safeguarding questions at interview. Again, some of you won't be used to the practice of interviewing governors for the post of governor, but if you are appointing a governor yourself, so they're not elected, they are not appointed by an external body, it is your appointment, it's going back to saying, what is our process? As a chair of a school where we have a number of co-opted governors, myself and another member of the governing body always have a type of interview. We might not call it an interview, but it certainly explores safeguarding questions as part of that conversation, and it's a written down part of our process. So again, we're not expecting every governing board to look exactly the same, but if you appoint your own governors, what does that look like? More importantly, when you're inducting any governor, whether they have been, whether they're coming to you as an elected or appointed elsewhere type of governor, what is your induction process around safeguarding expectations in the school, and what training might you expect them to undertake immediately or in their first 6 months in the role, so that they are part of that culture?
Good stuff. Okay, well, I think everybody's voted now who's going to, so we will share those results of the poll with you, and they should be up on the slide now. And that's a fairly strong picture. Yeah. So the majority of people in all cases doing all of those things, which is actually, I think, actually quite heartening to actually see that. So thank you for that, folks. Again, if you've actually come up with perhaps some of those that aren't happening in your school, you might want to go back and reflect on that. Just very aware that time is rapidly disappearing. If we haven't answered your specific, and there's a couple of very specific questions that I know we haven't addressed this morning, we'll talk to the guys at Governors for Schools and come back to you individually on 1 or 2 of those. And again, Tracy, I can see your questions here, and also Anne-Marie will answer those specifically. But just to say thank you very much indeed for joining us today. We hope the webinar has been useful. Thank you for all of the questions. There have been a lot of questions today. Hopefully, if we haven't mentioned you specifically, we have actually got round to answering the questions through perhaps talking about themed questions on the session this morning.
And more importantly, that you've identified areas where you might want to test out your understanding back at your own school or academy level, which means that you are better informed and more confident at holding the school to account.
And one very good way of holding the school to account, we've got a number of questions here about how long should we leave it to chase our preferences, how long do we need to go before people need to be re-DBS. Ask those in school, because that's not actually an unfair question. It's a very good way of not only confirming your own understanding, but ensuring that the school is aware, and if they don't, they can go and look it up themselves, and that can't be bad practice either, I would suggest. So on that note, folks, just to say thank you very much indeed for joining us this morning, and we look forward to welcoming you back to another Governors for Schools webinar hosted by Better Governor in the not too distant future. Thank you.
Thank you, goodbye.